I want to say first how deeply thankful I am to Gary and the others who've initiated this. I think this project has profound possibilities. I think it will frustrate us greatly and take far longer than we assume, but it's one of the few that I think may cut deeply enough to actually make a difference. And of course, I'm looking forward to reading Mila's paper as well as others that will get circulated. And this kind of work has been my life since my graduate work, going back to the mid-60s. I began thinking then about what now is called paradigm change, although Kuhn's book had been written, but it wasn't yet fashionable. And doing it at a whole civilizational level. So the question I want to raise with you is a new paradigm, leaving aside the meaning of that word. At some point, somebody, for our purposes of this group and this work, needs to define what we mean by a paradigm, or at least explore it in a way so that we're dancing reasonably well on the same space together. But I'll just leave that aside. My question is, for what? The project is talking for the moment about a new paradigm of development. So, what are the options for a new paradigm? For development, I don't quarrel with that entirely, and yet it is so encompassing that it makes no distinctions at all, locally, globally, at any time in history, that it strikes me as being maybe a long-term aspiration, but we need some shorter-term or some greater specification in the short run. Is it a paradigm for human civilization, which some people talk about? And the trouble I have with the language of civilization is that unless one specifies the meaning of it, there are so many different meanings to the word civilization, from the root meaning of simply meaning human life since we had settlement, which then refers to the last 10,000 years, as I'm sure we all know, of human history, but nothing before then, which I have always felt underestimates both the importance, not just emotionally, but from our own point of view, to come to terms with the fact that for 95 cents of, and the next one please, for 95% of our life as a species, we have lived as a tribal people. And therefore, any sense of civilization I want to talk about, I want to now include that 95% of our experience, simply because we are in so many ways hardwired for that life. It's unlikely that as a species we have shucked off all the habits we learned over 190,000 years, let alone all our pre-Homo sapien life. So the thing that I come down to is the following. If you could show the next slide, it's got my short answers to each of those questions. And what you see is that I've come to make a distinction. So really what I want to do now is just tell you a little bit about my own journey in a way that may be helpful to this project. Because I have floundered in this work for a very long time, and so this can just be sharing of some insight that may or may not be helpful. If it isn't, it can simply be ignored and dropped. But I've come to make a distinction between what I call forms of civilization, and I'll come to that in a minute, and human cultures. So that, for example, by a form of civilization, I've already referred to what has been the dominant form for us as a species, namely as tribal species, tribal peoples in small groups who basically were somewhat nomadic. That's a form of civilization. And one of the things that's interesting is whether you're looking at the Cree of the plains of North America before contact with Europeans, or you're looking at people in Siberia who are also nomadic, or people who are in Africa who are nomadic. They have more in common in terms of their ways of living and their understandings of what life is about than anything else. In other words, people within a form of civilization are essentially isomorphic with each other. Of course, there are cultural differences. In the same way, there are huge cultural differences between the way the Danes, the French, the Germans, and to some extent now, the Chinese claim they are becoming modern, do modernity. The thing that is interesting about modernity is that people who have any long experience with modernity in attitudes, in values, in the categories they use to create life, in the ways they govern themselves, in what they take as real as important and what they ignore, the blind spots as well as the things they are attentive to, are far more similar than to those same people at an earlier stage in their life. And so that my suggestion is for us to think about, not merely here, but through the whole project, is that I think we're looking for a paradigm. In my language, we're looking for a paradigm of a new form of civilization. The next slide. This next slide is a very crude, just a very crude way of dividing up. There are more formal academic ways that essentially map onto these spaces. But I use these slides with businessmen and community folks and others. And so all it's meant to do is indicate that if you were given a choice of living in some other physical place more than 10,000 years ago, your only choice of a form of civilization, regardless of what culture it was in, what continent it was on, your only choice was as a tribal culture. About 5,000 years ago, your only choice was, you had two choices, of a settled culture or tribal cultures. Then, as we know, regional empires emerged. And I'm thinking of Greece, I'm thinking of Rome, I'm thinking of China. And so that if you were asked the question 1,000 years ago by somebody who had a time machine, I can drop you, or at least a space machine, I can drop you in time and space in any place, where would you like to go? You had three ways, three different forms of civilization that could be your choice. If you were dropped in China 1,000 years ago, you'd be in a regional empire. If you were dropped on the plains of Canada 1,000 years ago, you'd be in tribal cultures. If you were dropped in Central America 1,000 years ago, you'd be in a regional empire. If you were dropped in most of Europe, you were in settled cultures, not yet a regional empire. And of course, we know that in the last 1,000 years, modern industrial cultures have emerged. And that's a form of civilization that is disruptive of, if not destructive to, all of the previous forms. The big black question marks that are there emerge out of the work of the Club of Rome and Thomas Homer Dixon and, all kinds of people. One of the interesting questions is that the human problematique is in part that there is no guarantee that any existing form of civilization can cope with the emerging conditions of the 21st century, and there's increasing evidence that none of them can. People up the Amazon know how to live at one with nature, but they don't know how to deal with the kind of climate change that a modern industrial world inflicts on them. And therefore, from their point of view, they will be puzzled why the Amazon will die and they with it. That will be true of us as well as others. And so the question I'm raising about the question of a new paradigm is, I find it helpful to think not only when we think of the problematique as raising questions about the adequacy of the to the future of any existing form of civilization, I find it helpful to ask the question as an empirical question, is there already evidence that a new form of civilization, that is one that literally moves beyond the modern industrial form, is already emerging from within the modern industrial form of civilization? And my own answer to that would be yes, although there is very little written about this. It is not a lively question. As Gary has already pointed out, the overwhelming framing of the human problematique, even within the Club of Rome, is within a modern industrial frame of reference. And we have barely begun to, and nowhere in the UN system is there a lively conversation about the emergence of a new form of civilization, and that our adaptation is not adaptation of that form, but adaptation as we evolve from it into something else. And while a few books and a somewhat larger number of articles, but you could put them in a relatively small shelf space, just a few feet or meters of shelf space, compared to the miles of shelf space that has been written about the human problematique within the modern industrial form. And so the next slide will just say that from my point of view, what I think is happening on the planet now is that the modern industrial form of civilization is both going global. On the one hand, it is the world's largest missionary movement ever in history. It makes Christian and even Islamic missionary movements look penny ante. The largest missionary movement is that for the modern industrial civilization. And the interesting thing is that virtually all cultures who are receiving it do so openly and in welcoming ways. You see that in not just Singapore and China, you see it virtually every place in the world. A new business school is opened, people celebrate it, and we're opening 1,000 a year. And I think the paradigm change we're facing is of our modern industrial form, and we don't even know this yet. And if this project did no more than help put that on the table as a significant agenda item, it would be a very substantial movement beyond the work of the Club of Rome, building on it. I don't mean in any sense to make light of the work of the Club of Rome. I know many of those people and hugely admire them. But the work we now have to do in the 21st century, I think, is to build on that work and all that has been done and move on it in a fundamentally new way. Says he as if he knows what he's talking about. Thank you.